Welcome back, everybody. Episode number 39 of the Roses and Rhetoric podcast. I'm your host, Jimmy Hackett. Joining me, my charming guest co-host this week,
Jack Urness in the house.
Jack, good to see you again. Of course, fans of the show will remember Jack. He's been on our show before. Joe is traveling this week, so we'll be sure to check in with him when he's back. Should be back in the studio for next week's show. But for this week, we're happy to have Jack. Of course, Jack also has his own podcast, World's Best Podcast with Jack and Reno. Be sure to find them wherever podcasts are found. And then also follow Jack on Twitter, handle at Jack Urness. Urness is spelled Urness. Jack, good to have you on the show.
Good to be here, Jimmy. Happy to be here.
So you're in Dallas now. I think last time we spoke, you were maybe in Portland, if I'm not mistaken, or...
Yeah, so I just moved to Dallas about 3 months ago. So if you have listened to our podcast, we've been on a little bit of a hiatus since I've been here, just trying to get settled. Sort of had a career shift, was in the construction world, and now I'm working sales for a startup, basically. So yeah, it's a big shift, and I'm getting used to it. Definitely one of the more challenging things I've done in my life. But after, I'm 3 months in here, and I'm super glad I made the decision, and just kind of been through a lot of growth in the last few months, and feel like I'm on the right trajectory. So.
That sounds really exciting. And I mentioned Portland, just before we began recording, I mentioned to one of our other viewers who also has a show, Mutant Fox. He runs a streaming channel and also kind of a tech channel, and he's on Twitter as well. Mentioned, and he wasn't sure though if we were aware of this. Joe and I had talked about infrastructure and stockpiling and a few episodes ago. And one of our listeners, again, Mutant Fox, mentioned to us that there was some kind of chlorine shortage for water treatment out in Portland, Oregon, and maybe even more broad in that region. I don't know the full scope. But I looked into it a little bit, and basically from what I can gather, one of the contributing factors is that there was a power disruption at a chlorine manufacturing plant. And anytime I see a story like that, or there's a shortage, I always go back to Nassim Taleb, Anti-Fragile, and just like the most simple thing anybody can do to like start building some anti-fragility in your life, or rather to even just start building some resilience in your life, is to always have a little bit more than what you need, and preferably more than that. That way, if anything happens, you're still good to go. Very good, very good. Well, Jack, today we're continuing our discussion with the beginning of infinity. We're talking about chapters 10, 11, and 12. And I thought, before diving into each of those chapters specifically, I wanted to kind of maybe set the stage a little bit with those three chapters. So the first one is the Dream of Socrates. And, in this chapter, David Deutsch writes a kind of a fictitious story about Socrates being approached by a deity in a dream. And through that discussion, they come to explore the ways that humans obtain knowledge. And, again, it follows and along this lines of conjecture and criticism. And they dive into a discussion about what separates societies that engage in that kind of behavior from societies that are very much against that kind of behavior. And they kind of set it up as between Athens and Sparta. So that would be chapter 10. Again, we'll get into that in a little more detail in just a moment. Chapter 11, a really easy read, right? I mean, just about the multiverse, how complicated could it be? And we'll definitely come, like I said, we'll get into this in more detail in a moment. And that brings us, yeah.
Right. The multiverse is real now.
Yeah, it was quite impressive. And then chapter 12, which has us talking about this notion of bad philosophy and really a focus on the implications for bad philosophy in scientific societies, how bad philosophy hinders scientific growth, and but broader than that as well, how it really just inhibits us. And he goes into a discussion about what does and doesn't make bad philosophy. And we'll get into that definition as well. But let's start with chapter 10, and let's start with the Dream of Socrates. So just, I'm interested in kind of your thoughts off the bat about this chapter, what parts of it stood out to you, and what did you take away from it?
Well, so this chapter 10 here was for me, it was really interesting to read this because I thought like when we get toward the end here, one of the main takeaways, is this idea that our that like physical reality or the reality we experience, is sort of a projection of the mind, in the sense that, I feel like we should break down some more of what's going on in the
absolutely.
first, but yeah. So in the chapter here, you have Hermes visits Socrates in a dream, where they'd gone to see the oracle, and while they're waiting for the oracle, Hermes visits Socrates in the dream and starts kind of asking him questions, just sort of to challenge Socrates' thought. And as we get toward, as they go through just a number of back and forth, and get to what's the field of study that he mentions to Plato afterward?
Yeah, epistemology.
Epistemology, yeah. Okay,
right.
that's our word, yeah.
Right.
Which is like reason, right?
Yeah, it's kind of it's the notion. How do we obtain knowledge? How
Okay. How do we obtain knowledge?
Yeah.
And so it gave the implication, right? So it basically says, which from science is sort of proven to be true, our mind is really almost projecting reality more so than you're experiencing it, right? So like you have these sensors in your eyes and you have ears as sensors, but it's really your brain that takes in all this information and creates the reality that you experience. And so anything that we understand is sort of starts from a guess of like what it could be.
Right.
And then through guesses and predictions, you're able to create a more and more accurate model of whatever the actual physical world is. And it's like, it kind of makes you question like what is like fundamental truth, and what is like, how do we have knowledge like we do? Like how do we acquire new knowledge given our constraints, and like how have we come so far? Like it's incredible that it's been so accurate for so long.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good preface for this. So many directions that this chapter goes into. Definitely, I feel like every time we cover a new chapter, I say this, but definitely this is a key chapter of the book. The first maybe like, half of the book was maybe even a little more, a little lighter. It talks about creativity and about optimism, and it's kind of, all this kind of stuff. And now it's like getting a little more serious. It's like now mommy and daddy are coming home. It's time to put away the crafts, and and creativity time is over. Now mommy and daddy are home. They're talking about some big ideas, and I think you notice that shift in the book with the chapter on optimism, but this chapter really starts to drive home some of the points, because as we'll get into in later chapters, having these ideas as cornerstones in how we approach the reality has consequences. And if we have, as we'll get to in chapter 12, when we have bad ideas, we have bad outcomes. And so I think this chapter really starts to drive home that message, because, and I really like this part too, just tying back into that idea of, knowing what's real and what's not real, is this idea where, at one point Socrates and Hermes, who is a deity in Greek mythology, basically, are talking, and Socrates is trying to figure out, am I really talking to a god, or is it a dream? And they come to the realization that if you obtain a good idea, it doesn't matter where the idea came from. If it was a dream, if it was divine inspiration, if it was, whatever it was, good ideas can come from unlikely sources, and even sources that are bad. If someone is, known to be a liar and this and that, and they happen to tell you something that ends up being true, it doesn't matter where the idea came from. It's the ability of the idea to withstand criticism that determines the value of the idea. And I thought that was an interesting point. And then I also like kind of your discussion on this idea of how our brain makes sense of the world around us. And there's a book that Joe and I have talked about maybe on one other show, but it's an interesting book. It's about neuroscience. It's called The Brain Inside Out. And in the book, the author makes a claim that the brain is a much more active creator in a sense of how we perceive the world, and that, far from just being this hub that sits in our brain that just kind of accumulates sensory data, our brain is always in the process of doing little experiments and trying to understand the world through experimentation. And it's a very interesting perspective on how the brain actually works, because other ideas have the brain more as this very passive, kind of sitting back and taking the world in. And this author is saying, no, absolutely not. The brain is actively, using its vessel, its body, to experiment with the world, to understand things, and to create ideas about how the world should be, and then criticizing those ideas through these different experiments. So a really neat tie-in, I thought, with this book so far. And I think, probably something that we'll do, more in
Can
more
I
detail. Yeah,
can
go
I
ahead.
jump on that point right there?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So like what you're saying about the how the brain is doing a lot while you're going through. Well, it's really easy to see how much. So all right, so I'm going to take a step back here. So another thing that I've been doing a ton the last few months is I've gotten like way into meditating and sort of really studying the mind, which is what I consider which is how I would really define meditating, is just like just sitting still, focusing on your breath, and just watching the mind and seeing what it does. And I had this wild experience the other day where the only thing I could compare it to was like a time I took a lot of psilocybin, and it was almost like a flip of reality, where I sort of had this, and this is really trippy for me because I read this like 3 days afterward, like 3 or 4 days after this experience. And I had this like almost experiential version of this, like my mind being what was creating reality rather than me experiencing reality direct. Like I experienced that flip, like from my perspective. And you can kind of see how this is true with it's really easy if you just look around your room. Like when your brain looks around this room, almost at like the room that you're in right now, almost everything in there is a human construct. Like these aren't things that exist in nature. Like walls that's not a nature thing. Right. Doors, lamps, and we know what these things are, and we know what they're called. And that's because of our brain, like overlaying on reality. Like this has no name by the universe, or the lamp has no name given by the universe. That's a human driven thing and driven by your brain. And so when you look at the world, you don't just see it for what it is, you see it for what we've created. Yeah. Which is a lot different, because if you're just an objective observer, these things don't actually have names or aren't called anything. And so I think that's really interesting as far as what this book, just for me, for this chapter, goes to show. And that's kind of was one of my takeaways, was like, yeah, it's as we move through the world, we have this overlay of we have our like the things we physically seeing, but then also this overlay of knowledge that's incorporated into the world. Yeah, I think that last sentence really well put. And I wanted to actually, so I'm going to go back to I think is the book again, in The Brain from the Inside Out. Really, really a great book. But in the book, there's this idea that tools, when early man was first creating tools, what we were doing is we were conceptualizing something in our head and then using our material around us to actually construct it. And so in a way, something like a hammer is a word, because it's just this idea that we've embodied in some physical form. And it's one of those ideas in a book that I've read once, and it's just really never left me, that was such a neat way of putting it, this idea that tools are words, that, what we're doing is we have ideas, and then we can actually put our ideas out into the world, and again, it's all, it's nothing mystical. It's just, how do you build a hammer? You take a rock, put on a stick. But this idea of having this idea that if I put a rock on a stick, it'll be a more effective weapon. But you have that idea, and then you do it by putting the rock on the stick, and now you have this weapon that you thought of and then made. And so when we look around us and we see, and you put it beautifully, when we see doors, when we see roofs, when we see, I'm seeing cars in the parking lot. None of these things
just came about. These were all made by people using their brains to conceptualize, using a knowledge of physics and of, chemistry and all this other things, to conceptualize an idea and then actually building it. And as a result, there are these things. If we, speculate for a moment, if only Earth has life and there's no other life in the universe, there's a very, very, very good chance that on this planet, things exist that don't exist anywhere else, like the Ford Motor Company or the watch on your wrist or the microphone that you're speaking into. These things will just come out of nature the way that like a rock or like, waterfall or things that have like erosion or something. But these things take a mind, they take a level of intelligence to actually create. And as a result, we're able to create things that are radically different than anything else you'll ever find in the world. And they're on here because we have a brain that we can actually. And I think David Deutsch mentions this in an earlier chapter, but this idea of what separates the way that genetics create knowledge versus the way that brains create knowledge. And essentially the difference is that brains can construct ideas in their head and criticize them without having to manifest anything physical. Whereas genes have to go through, because they can't, conceptualize, they don't have brains, they can't think the way that a brain does. So for genetics, it's all right, this gene happens, this thing lives, and either it reproduces or it doesn't. It has to do the experiment in reality, and that takes a long time. Whereas your brain can think, if I put that light switch there, I might cause a house fire. So I'm going to put it somewhere. We can work through, things in our head. And as a result, that's how we're able to think through, we're able to do some of the experimental work in our head, so to speak, without having to do it out in reality. And that saves some time and some effort. I had one more thing I for sure wanted to say on this chapter, but I wanted to kind of give it back to you because I thought that was really well put your example.
I was kind of laughing there because my mic, I was looking at it and the clamp broke. So I had to kind of engineer, I don't know if you can see this.
There it is.
Sort of counterweight mechanism here to hold my mic up.
Now let me tell you something. My wife is a
visualized it in my mind, and it became true.
Right. No. Right. You built it.
Yeah.
I know for a fact that book on the bottom of that pile is the Goblet of Fire. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, that was pretty good.
Yeah. Boom, baby.
Well, I had okay, but there was a Harry Potter book.
No, right. So I had a primer.
So you did have some association there.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Well, so I know that red and black, or maroon black, or whatever it is. I've seen that book so many freaking times. My wife is a big Harry Potter fan. We make it work anyways. But the last sentence of this chapter, I thought it's worth reading for verbatim. The way to converge with each other is to converge upon the truth. Now, I've mentioned this to Joe a few times, that this book, I think, could serve a role of kind of being a big tent, so to speak, that anybody can go underneath and try to start working together, or whatever you want to call it. And I thought, as I was thinking through that, I was like, why do I think that about this book, and how would I? And then David Deutsch lays it out perfectly in that last sentence. Everybody feels disjointed. We're not together. We're out this other stuff. How do we come together? There's really only one way: to use conjecture and criticism to converge upon reality, to converge upon the truth.
It's, I mean, there's a few people out there doing it. But it feels like a lot of people are just not even in the realm of looking at the world that way.
I agree with you. And I don't know if you maybe, if you ever did debate team in high school or anything. I did it for about a semester. I was not very good. I lost every time. I really lost. I mean, it was horrible. But I remember, my wife and I were talking about this earlier last week, and it was this idea that usually we stop conversations where they should be beginning.
Yeah.
Normally we stop a conversation when people say, "Oh, okay, we'll just agree to disagree." And it's like in conjecture criticism world, or if you will, in the debate team world, that's actually where the debate starts. You highlight the differences between the two opposing sides. You know, I'm arguing this point of view, you're arguing this point of view. You agree that you disagree, but then that's where the conversation starts. And then you try to, and of course, in debate, the reason I don't like debate is because you assume that one of the two rounds has the right answer. And in reality, as is maybe perhaps most often the case, both sides have it wrong. And the truth is something different. And not always in between the two starting, you know, this idea that the truth is in the middle. Sometimes, other times it's in a different ballpark, different universe in some cases. And so that's why I don't like debate. And it's also inherently combative because it's, you know, you're arguing against somebody. It's you versus them. I always hate that. I don't know if you have a pet peeve. I always hate when I'm on YouTube and I see something like so-and-so destroys so-and-so.
Destroys, and they're all dramatic. Yeah.
And it's like, and usually it's like not even a destruction. It's just like, they made a good point. Like
Jordan
destroyed.
Peterson destroys SJW.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If you search it, you'll have no less than like 10,000 videos. And like, a lot of times it's kind of like, did they really? Like, I don't even know if they were right. Did they really even destroy them in that?
Yeah, no, it's just
it's totally subjective.
I mean, I think that's a really good point you make. And I think that I actually, this is funny because I was listening to a Jordan Peterson podcast yesterday. I finished up this morning. Really good one. Actually, most recent one he has out. I can't remember the guy's name who's it was with, but I'm definitely going to look into him more because he was really interesting. But they were talking about how you can debate in either the spirit of knowledge or the spirit of victory. And so like a lot of people debate in this, it's in this with the spirit of trying to get victory. But if you debate like underneath the logos, you're really like trying to, like, you're separating the idea from yourself. And this, because ideas are sort of entities that exist. Like I think if I were to say one of the major problems, just kind of I can't really speak for the whole world, but certainly the US, is ideas have become people's identities. Instead of, which it should not be that way, because if an idea is your identity, then it becomes impossible to criticize. Ideas exist separate of you, and then they need to be in the realm of criticism. Ideas that like aren't allowed to be criticized, while it doesn't necessarily make them untrue, it certainly makes it so there's no way to know they're true.
Well put.
Yeah.
And I think that's spot on. And I think one of the things is this idea that you're absolutely right. We shouldn't put our ideas with our identity. We should all be trying to identify, if you will, as people that are trying to seek the truth through conjecture and criticism. I was making fun of this. I mean, I'm not making fun of it. I mean, it was of course horrible what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany. But that basically, I mean, it was, you know, it would have been impossible to convince the Nazi Party, you know, that what they were thinking was wrong because they were closed off to that criticism. And that would be true, I'm sure, of the white supremacists today or something along. I mean, I don't know anything about those people, but I would imagine it's very similar to that. That it's just, it's immediately closed off from criticism. You can't even challenge it. Because to challenge it is, like you're saying, a threat to the identity of the person. Which actually I think ties into with the notion of bad philosophy, which we'll come back to. But essentially, a bad philosophy is a philosophy that closes itself to criticism. And why is it bad? Because then it can't improve. It can't improve. You have no way of improving an idea if you can't criticize the idea. It can't be improved upon. I also you said one other thing that I thought was really interesting, this idea that ideas kind of exist on their own. That's definitely a big part in the beginning of Infinity when they talk about memes and how these ideas really do live inside of our minds. And they kind of hop from mind to mind. That and like, I think an example he gives is like the idea of a joke. Like if you hear a joke and you tell it to somebody else, that joke's now multiplied itself and it can spread throughout, you know, the world. Now I was thinking, you know, really, you know, citizens of a country are, you know, have many responsibilities to be sure, but one of them is that we have to be vessels for good ideas that are in our country. We have to be able to explain and defend good ideas in our country. And I don't know that we can do that. I really don't. I don't know that I could do it. But I think we should be able to. And I think that's the value of a subject like social studies, or, you know, sometimes they call it civics. Why are those classes important? Because every society will be tempted by bad ideas. And unless you're able to defend the good ideas that you have happened to stumble upon, nothing makes a good idea invincible. Bad ideas overtake good ideas all of the time. There's no such thing as a nation being immortal from becoming worse than it was in the past. There's no guarantee that things improve forever or any other such nonsense. Things can always get worse, and good ideas can always be overpowered by bad ideas. The example in this chapter was when Sparta defeated Greece, even though or Athens, even though supposedly Greece was, I guess I'm saying Greece, Athens was this more open society where they were engaging. It was essentially the golden age of Athens. You had this conjecture and criticism working well. It didn't matter. The Spartans still destroyed it, even though they were a totally closed society. But I was thinking about that a lot, about how incumbent upon us it is. And I don't think we realize this when we're young. I mean, I certainly did not. I mean, I don't think maybe you did, but when you're in a high school and you're studying social studies, I don't think you're thinking, I need to be able to defend why, something like a constitution matters, why something like the right to vote matters, why something, whatever it is, we need to be able to defend these things well. And I don't always know that weight is present in the classroom the way that it should be. I think it's like a subject that you have to pass, right? Here's a test and you take the test and it kind of is on, but really these are very important subjects. Then I don't know that we're giving them their due respect. I mean, I'm maybe you disagree, but
no, I agree completely. And I actually really hadn't, you just kind of inspired a thought a little bit there, because it does seem like, as a lot of people are getting out of college and in their 20s, and then having been taught a lot about the world, but not really trying to, I think there's a lot of people that have been taught a lot about the world, but not really tried to like look in and challenge the things they've been told. Right.
Right.
And so like your engineering degree, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So am I. And so when we're in school, like everything we are taught is like provably true. Right.
Right.
And so you kind of start to develop this engineer's way of looking in the world is like, it's kind of a series of problems and solutions. Like, I even take the engineering mindset into the sales world now. And like, the problem is how do I get customers?
Right.
And then I like look at it from like, here's the problem. What are the variables I have in order to find the most optimal solution? And so from that lens, the world kind of becomes like a solvable problem. But I think that's and it's not the only workable lens. Obviously, there's many lenses that you can work through the world. But there's a lot of people that start to realize that the government and all the rules are kind of a human created construct. And their initial reaction to that is they try to look at the motivations or their perceived motivations of the people in power that created the rules. Right. So which isn't really the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, what are the effect the current rules are having? Right. Because like you said before, it doesn't matter if somebody told you something as a complete joke. If it turned out to be true, it's true. And so when you have this lens of trying to figure out what the strategy was to get to where we are and then like undermine it, you're really missing the point, because you need to look what's actually the actual cause and effect are. And it doesn't matter who made the rules in that regard. What matters is what they're doing, and then what are the practical steps we can take to change them to get the results we want.
I think that's 100% correct. I think that's really well put. And, you're actually tying really well into some other things I wanted to talk about. And I thank you for doing that. I don't know if you're familiar. You probably have heard it's a poem or a song. The revolution will not be televised. If you're it's a very famous kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's from Gil Scott Heron, and I listened to a not really even an interview, but like a really brief kind of it looked like someone had him on like a cell phone camera, and they were talking to him about that word, and he said something that I thought was really interesting and really kind of caused me to kind of like sit back and really, it was interesting what he said. And he said, blacks, I'm not going to get the whole quote right, but more or less something like this. He was saying, blacks are really the only Americans, because being born American for them didn't matter. They had to use the system to fight for their rights. Basically, they had to use the march, they had to use the court system, they had to use free speech to actually get what they wanted. This would have all been, during the 60s fighting for civil rights. And I thought that really was, in a way, of course, it would have been a better world had blacks not had to do that. No one disagrees with that. But the fact that that Black Americans could use the system, as flawed as it was, to improve the system, I think says a lot about the leadership you had in the Black community at that time, but then also something about the power and the value of things like a legal system, free speech, the right to protest, because there are people who depend on these things and have used these things historically to affect change. And I think it says a lot about, and again, this gets into this notion of conjecture and criticism, but it says a lot about a system where people who are disenfranchised can still use that system to improve their lives. And now I was just thinking about that a lot. I was just thinking about, the way that, people have depended on these systems for progress, really. And I thought it was a very powerful idea. And I'm not a historian on that era, but definitely the revolution will not be televised is a very interesting piece and an important piece. And if I thought that idea that that Black Americans really had to put their rights through the paces, that these weren't just things on a mantle. You have freedom of speech, you have the right to protest, you have whatever it is. Great. There's no, we need to use those. We need to actually put this system to work, because what we have now isn't good enough. And I thought that was just very powerful. I really thought that was very powerful from him.
Yeah, the whole civil rights movement is a super powerful thing, and yeah, absolutely amazing.
I have this idea that we always, America being supposedly, and I think working towards this all the time, but this idea of being a nation of ideas versus a nation of ethnicity, really, anybody can become an American. Once you become a citizen, you're as an American as anybody else. And other countries have that too, but in some way, because I don't really have any French ancestry, I can't really become French. Like I can't do that. But in a way, anybody can become American. And I think that shows us the value of ideas, but more importantly, the value of a system that allows ideas to improve upon themselves. And so, earlier, and I was saying this idea of a big data philosophy, because I think any country would value from this. But because America is a country of ideas, we have to have a process of conjecture and criticism in place for that system to work. Otherwise, our ideas, as you were saying earlier, they won't improve. We need to become, we don't want to identify with any idea in particular, but I do think we want to identify with a process. I think we do want to identify with the conjecture and criticism process, because that is a tool that we can use for improving the ideas that we have competing between the different minds of people in this country. And really, every 2 years, what really matters is how these ideas manifest themselves in the minds of the voters. And that's the battleground. The memes that are in place during voting times is really, a motor that our country runs, every 2 years or so. And so I think that process is important, and I think that this book gets people back on that track. I've been talking a lot. Let me give it back to you. Other ideas from this chapter, other ideas from the Dream of Socrates.
Well, I actually think that covers it pretty good for me. I mean, I do really enjoy what you said about, the U.S. has this self-correcting system. That's it's the way it's built. The fact that, and I think you gave the perfect example with the civil rights movement. And it's like we want to. That's kind of why it's also allowed America to be so like thrive so much? Well, one, because we live on like the best land in the world. I mean, not just like agriculturally,
Yeah,
and
right, right.
as far as what can be developed,
Right.
that's an advantage. We
Right.
can't like deny that.
No.
But our
Finding
system of
all the
government's
coal and
pretty-
natural gas that you could hope for is not a small contributor to the historical success of the United States and the oil
Yeah.
as well. Yes, that was very
Yeah.
important. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So that that's definitely plays a role.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much sums up the chapter for me. I mean, I think and it was really compelling for me and kind of opened my eyes to how much it really is like with debate. You need to do it underneath, like while following the logos and not victory, right? Like you have to. You're in pursuit of truth and philosophically being correct is sort of necessary if you're going to make any progress. And the other thing that I think this incorporates is you have to have an honest assessment of where you are before you can determine anywhere where you're going. If you have an idealized destination, but that doesn't take into account the current situation, then the only way you're going to get there is through physical force.
I think that's well put.
Yeah.
Well, good. So let's close out this chapter, and I'll bring it back to Bill Scott Heron just real quick, because it's actually fairly prescient for this chapter. An idea in the beginning of Infinity is that all observations are theory laden, that we only understand what we observe because we have an idea about what we're observing. And it actually ties in with this work, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. And in the interview that I'm talking about now, he goes on to explain what that title meant. And again, paraphrasing, not quoting verbatim, but the revolution will not be televised was given that phrase because the first steps in the revolution happen in someone's mind. They happen in our minds. They had to be realized, and the people had to realize that something wasn't right. And there's nothing that you can just show someone that will automatically make them change their mind. If they have an idea that the system that we're observing is good, and it won't matter what you show them. You need to show them. Now, maybe there are some exceptions to that, to be sure. I think video is powerful, but even still, no matter how powerful the imagery, there's always a way to rationalize what you're seeing. If you're not willing to change the ideas that are affecting our observations of the world, and so how do we do that? By conjecture and criticism, by allowing our ideas to be challenged by other people, and also just by ourselves. And I think that it's possible to do that as well. Let's transition to the multiverse. Now, I've mentioned this before. There was another show. There's actually at least two shows that have covered. I'm sure multiple, but that have covered the beginning of Infinity. And I listened to one, and I'm skipping on the name, but basically it was funny because in their show, these obviously were two smart guys, and they were like, yeah, I think the multiverse we're probably not going to cover that much because it's a lot to go into. And I remember when Joe and I first started going into this, I was kind of like, yeah, we might do a similar thing. This is kind of a heavy chapter to go into. I had an idea for this chapter, but before I give my idea, I want to hear your idea. Guests go first. Tell me your thoughts on the multiverse. This is chapter 11. We're talking about the beginning of Infinity, and joining me this week as our special guest host is Jack Urness. But give me your take on the multiverse and on that chapter, because it was not a light read.
Oh, I am convinced on the multiverse after reading the chapter. So I'll do my best to summarize, and then you correct me if there's
hell no. I'm going to be nodding along anything you're saying, because I have no freaking idea what the hell is going on in this chapter. No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm interested in this. So let me ask you this before you start. I know you said engineering degree. What, mechanical, electrical?
I was mechanical.
Mechanical. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So fair amount of physics in that degree, and
Yeah, we did a lot of physics, thermo, fluids.
Sure.
Did a
Did you
lot
find
of
yourself pulling on that knowledge when you were reading this chapter? Did you try to connect it back to school or anything like that? Or did you ever do any quantum mechanics, like physical chemistry?
Quantum mechanics has really fascinated me from the perspective of like how much school study of quantum mechanics. I think we touched on it in like third term physics. It wasn't a whole ton.
Sure.
But as far as like conceptually and just kind of like understand, like having looked at experiments, I've done a lot of that in my free time and just looked at the experiment and like, I haven't like run any on my own, but just watch YouTube videos. I started doing it after I watched this podcast with, it was Roger Penrose on Lex Friedman. And he was talking about how he thinks that we will understand what consciousness is, like where the limitations of quantum physics are and what we don't understand about consciousness. And somehow those will tie together. So that made me really interested in looking at quantum mechanics. And it's really weird, the provable experiments that they've come up with, that like literally adding an observer will cause light particles to define themselves. And if you remove the observer, they remain in this undefined state. And it's really not an easy thing to do, to describe these experiments with words and no visuals. But if you just look up like thin slit experiments and watch a few videos, conceptually it starts to make sense pretty quickly. The other pattern they noticed was with when they were measuring like electron spin. Basically, they were measuring the probability that an electron should come out with a certain spin value, right? And in theory, like when they do like in like based on probability or like the quantum mechanics equations, the value you would get would be like some sinusoidal thing that's like not quite 2/3. It's like 73% or something like that. Because it's not a discrete plot, but in real life, you would expect it to be 2/3 because of basic probability laws. But when you return this experiment, you get the quantum mechanics result and not what would be explained by classical probability or mechanics. Yes. And so it's super fascinating in that regard. But this chapter doesn't really talk into that part of the quantum mechanics. But what it does talk about, or well, it does, but it's not those experiments directly. Instead, it talks about, well, the easy way to describe it is the best example they gave for the multiverse being real. And this goes back to the beginning of the book and throughout the book, there's this idea that good explanations have reach, right? So if you have a very specific explanation, like for instance, the example they give in the book is, because the earth is tilted at 22 degrees and rotates around the sun, like we can predict the seasons. We can also predict that above a certain latitude, it will be sun 6 months a year and dark 6 months a year. And all these additional predictions come out from this like super specific explanation, which you couldn't get, because the original explanation is like, Persephone follows the sun across the sky, and you just can't extrapolate as much information. And so what David Deutsch is saying is that because of experiments run in quantum mechanics, the clearest solution is that the multiverse does exist, and that what the implication of that is that every conceivable idea within like story or thing you can conceptualize within the laws of physics exists.
You're right.
Which is like nuts. And the proof he gives, which I thought was the most compelling one, was the quantum computer, which basically the idea here is that so you get 10, so I think they're up to 10 is what he said right now. So you take these 10 quantum particles that sort of go through this black box computation phase. And so there's this idea of like there's congruency in the universe. And so particles become entangled in the sense that if they're going to be in the same universe, like if one has interacted with another and then like as a result needs to behave a certain way, it will. And so like when you hear about entanglement and instantaneous like instantaneous information exchange, it's because like when you observe particle A, particle B that it had been entangled with will define its state instantly as well. And so quantum computing takes the fact, or basically takes into account that if you put this through the black box, the particles will go through all possible pathways that they could and all the ways they could interact with each other, but return to some initial state before the end. And basically because they converged, like all of those universes will converge too. And it's still congruent with our world because we didn't interact with it, right? Because it was in this black box. And so it split and it split and it split. And then it came back together before the end and returns this result. And so like that was really compelling to me because how else could you explain the resultant computing power that occurred over the duration of the time if not every single possible pathway for the particles to take existed, even though when we observe it, they would only have time for one.
Yeah, that's mind blowing.
I don't know how well I explained that.
No, well, I won't improve upon it. I'm going to grab a book that I really like. Give me just 1 second.
Okay.
All right, 1 second, and maybe right on time. So I also kind of had a after school, kind of interest in quantum mechanics, and I was going to say, we're talking about I will say one of the things that David Deutsch criticizes is this idea of the Copenhagen interpretation, and what David Deutsch suggests as a replacement is a multiverse explanation, although I think it might also be called many worlds explanation. I think those might be the same thing. But for anybody listening to this, there's a lot in this chapter. It would be very hard to give a good summary of the chapter because it involves some tricky visuals that are hard to get off over the air like this. So instead, what I thought I would do is I would give a couple of tips that I have found useful for quantum mechanics self-study. And one of the things I will say, and I'm sure Jack, you've encountered no shortage of this as well. There's a lot of bogus BS that goes with quantum mechanics, with like mysticism and like crystal healing and all this other silliness that goes on. And I would say, one of the first thing is like when you get into quantum mechanics is like try to protect yourself from like bad metaphors that people will give for it. Scott Adams always talks about how bad analogies are, and there's definitely no shortage of people using analogies in quantum mechanics. I would also say, and this is maybe slightly, maybe not the first thing that you would encounter when you start studying QM in like school. So like my exposure to quantum mechanics was in physical chemistry. So, took that as like a senior maybe, or maybe a junior in college. And they go a little bit, and again, you start with like the history of it. So like, double slit experiment and, so on and so forth, the debates between Einstein and Schrodinger and, back and forth, or whoever was in those debates. But I would say the key thing to wrap your head around when you're first starting quantum mechanics is to understand what actually makes it different than classical mechanics, and what are the things that happen in a quantum mechanics experiment that are unexplainable by classical mechanics. And to kind of give people a teaser, if you will, on a place to start would be to search two things on YouTube or on Google that will clearly explain at least one aspect, really kind of a central aspect of what differentiates quantum mechanics from the classical predictions. What can classical mechanics not explain that we observe in quantum mechanics? And what they would search, or what anybody who would want to know this, what they would search is what's called a Bell's game, BELL''S, and then subsequent with that as well, and you'll see, it'll be on the same page or in the same video, this notion of Bell's inequality. And so, basically Bell's inequality, from what I remember, is the outcome of a Bell's game. But I'm trying to leave it as kind of a cliffhanger, more to give myself the leverage of not having to explain it, because I would not do a very good job. I think it was either maybe Feynman, or I think it was Feynman, but if you know something, you can teach it. I cannot teach this. I do not know it. I'm not pretending to know it. But I would say start with Bell's game, start with Bell's inequality, to really wrap your head around, precisely what is it that quantum mechanics entails that cannot be predicted from classical mechanics. Because I will just say that, and Jack mentioned this earlier, things like entanglement are really unexplainable in kind of the pre-quantum mechanics classical physical description. That there are experiments we can do where the outcomes are completely unexplainable from classical mechanics.
Except for by the multiverse.
Well, right. So right, exactly right. And
As Joyce would claim.
Right. But even that is different than the Newtonian conception of physics.
Yeah.
So I would say start with those two things. Start with David Deutsch's criticism of the Copenhagen interpretation. Very much challenging the idea that really I would say what David Deutsch advocates is a kind of realism, that that reality exists and that it's real, and that challenging the notion of the Copenhagen interpretation, which was this probabilistic. There were entities that existed only in a probabilistic state, and the multiverse rebuttal to that is all of these things exist in kind of a certain proportion, and so 20% of the universes experience this outcome, other 20% experience this outcome, and so on and so forth, and that you don't know what universe you're in until you do the experiment, basically. So something like that. But I was going to give a shout out to a book that I found. I haven't read this book cover to cover, but I've read a decent portion of it. I really enjoy it. It's called Quantum Chance, and it's written by Nicholas. I'm not going to say it, but I'm going to guess his last name is Gisin, Gisin. But in this book, he explains Bell's game, Bell's inequality, and precisely what is different about quantum mechanics versus classical. Because when you start studying quantum mechanics and they have all these experiments that they're telling you about, it's easy to miss the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that there are outcomes in a quantum mechanical experiment that are unexplainable in the Newtonian framework. And so I would say really lock in on that. And I think a Bell's game, BELL''S, is a good place to start. What else is I going to say? Yeah, I already said protect yourself from bad analogies, bad metaphors. So many people on YouTube, change your vibration, be whatever. It's always like, stay away from that nonsense. Stay away from that. And then, check out, if you're looking for a book, again, not a light read, but, challenging, fun, interesting, check out Quantum Chance by Nicholas Gisin. And it sets the stage for what I would say what these stakes are in quantum mechanics. What does it tell you that you are not going to get from a Newtonian description? Beyond that, I'm hesitant to say anything more about this chapter because I really don't want to mislead the listeners. And I would just say that if you're interested in this, check out the book, Beginning of Infinity, go buy it, read it, and then try to work through these ideas on your own, because it is something that is
it's pretty mind-bending,
not easy to do. And I definitely left that chapter with a couple of questions of my own. I hopefully one day we'll get a chance to reach out to David Deutsch and talk to him about this, and it'd be fun to talk about that chapter in particular, because there's a lot there that I think is worth.
Well, one of the implications, like you said, if like every physical possible, like every conceivable idea that lies within the laws of physics will occur, That means every book you've ever read that lies like within the realm of physics is a true story somewhere.
Right. Well, I think we gave the example of, kind of like a joke, but like a rom-com or something, right? So
Yeah.
like that could be true. Like, all these different iterations of
He's not saying it
whatever.
could be true.
No, right. Right.
It is true.
That's right. Right. If it's allowed by physical law, then it will occur. And I think it's good to let, it's always like you read a chapter and a book like that, and it's kind of funny because like you read this chapter, right? All this stuff, and you think, is it true? Is it not? Who fucking knows? And it's like, and I still have to wake up tomorrow at 7 a.m. to go to work. It's like there's like this interesting, kind of like tug where it's like, I think deep down we all know that this really is, being alive is this truly, interesting experience. I mean, if you really kind of just like take a moment and like, all right, for the next 10 seconds, I'm going to just reflect on the idea that I am actually alive, that I'm living in this physical universe, that like I'm composed of these elements that came from the stars, and that there are these laws that govern all this. If we all just take a moment to like just a little bit of space and to reflect on that, it's bizarre that we don't spend more time doing it. I always think there's a great kind of, quote or, lecture or rant, I don't know what you call it, but from Sam Harris, where he's like, something to the effect of, we're all living our lives doing all these things, and at the same time, we're just completely ignoring the fact that one day we'll die, and our minds could just like go to oblivion. I mean, like we just don't ever, think about the weight of that. And I think it's a similar thing when we read a book like this on like, quantum mechanics or like relativity is just as weird and everything. And we have experiments that show that this stuff is that the outcomes are true. Of course, we're still improving the ideas that explain the outcomes, and that's that's the science in a sense. But we just live in this world that just has things that are so counterintuitive, and even just being alive is counterintuitive. I mean, the odds of that are all tiny, and then like the next day we go to work, and the next day we go to pick up our dry cleaning, and the next day we are mad because the line at the gas station is long. So it's like we have this like duality where it's like we understand the grand story at work, and we're mad because Blockbuster ran out of business. I mean, it's like we have like both going on at the exact same time.
I think that's a really good point to bring up. And actually, I think there is like a study done or something I read, and also can tell from experience, is that cultures that think about death more often are typically happier. Like I read that it was like Bhutan, which is like, not a low GDP country. And I'm sure you've heard of them before because they're like rated the happiest country in the world. But they have but when they're growing up, they are taught to like consider their own death every day. And that's something over the last few months that I don't know why I really got obsessed with this idea, and really just like, I just been like hung up on it, and like it caused me to like really go through, like really reflect on my life, to like, contemplate the fact that, well, it could, I mean, it's going to end. It doesn't just stick around forever. And it sort of made me face a lot of these things about my being and what I was doing. And like, I kind of told you I had this, experience in meditating, which I think was the culmination of all the events, or of all of this thinking. And it's kind of flipped the world on me. And like the fear of death has gone down basically to zero. Just because I can't describe it, but I feel like I understand death and what it is. And I think everyone is capable of doing it, but the answer isn't in the external world. You got to do a lot of self-reflecting and meditation. And my mental state is like been off the charts since this, like a couple weeks ago, and just the world's a lot clearer. So I'd encourage everybody to think about it.
Yeah,
Although you might lead to an existential crisis.
well, I'm always reminded of, and I've heard a few people make this comment. Both are authors, but this idea. One of them is Nassim Taleb, and then the other is Michael Schellenberger, and they both, I don't know that they both say it the exact same way, but this idea that people are kind of instinctually driven for a certain kind of immortality, and that there's like healthy drives for mortality, and then like others where it becomes like a perversion. But a lot of people, like, having kids is a way of kind of like living beyond yourself. Like you die, but your kids live on, and like you kind of continue in that way. Or like another way is that you write a book. It's like Shakespeare died however many 100 years ago, but his work still lives among us. And so it's like there's these interesting avenues of wanting to have, that I think are all healthy impulses, that you want to have impact, and you want to be you want to be a part of the show forever. But of course that's impossible, at least now, and I think probably for a while into the future, at least, it'll be impossible. And so we kind of accept, it's like, look, I can't be who I am forever, but if I write a book, if I create an idea, if I create something that that kind of lives outside of myself, then it's kind of a healthy avenue in some way for those kind of impulses. And yeah, I mean, I think, again, I would say the value of a book like this is that it gives you a lot to think about, but it's interesting how quickly, when we're engaging in our day-to-day lives, that we forget these big ideas that I'm sure most people have. They stumble upon these big ideas, and then they not, I shouldn't even say they, we, me, I do this too. We quickly forget them, or quickly forget their impact. I wanted to transition real quick, Jack. I wanted to go to our movie review this week from our official R&R film correspondent. But before doing so, any final thoughts on chapter 11? I know we left this one a little more vague, I think appropriately. It's a heavy chapter, and like I said, I know at least one other show that also left this chapter a little vague, and I understand why. It's a lot to unpack. But any other ideas on this chapter before we move on to our movie review?
No, I think that's good for me.
All right, wonderful. Well, today's film review is again from our official R&R film correspondent, and today we're talking about No Sudden Move, which is available on HBO Max. What's it about? A couple of low-level crooks in 1950s Detroit are hired to babysit an accountant's family while the accountant is forced to steal valuable documents from his boss's safe. When the plan goes haywire, they attempt to figure out who hired them and why in order to stay alive and set themselves up with the biggest possible score. Is it good? Definitely. Which isn't a surprise when you consider it's Steven Soderbergh's film. Soderbergh is one of the best and most prolific filmmakers of the last 3 decades, and there's no genre he's more steeped in than the heist film. He made the first 3 Ocean's movies, Logan Lucky, and his masterpiece, 1998's Out of Sight. There isn't a director better suited for this material, and he delivers once again. Like those films, No Sudden Move has a sense of fun, finding humor in characters' desperation or brief moments of absurdity, as when a woman has a blanket placed over her head so one of the criminals can relax and take his mask off. But it digs into its noir trappings and Detroit setting in a way that differentiates itself from Soderbergh's other capers. Double crosses and ulterior motives abound, to the extent that I rewatch a couple of scenes to keep things straight. And there's a sense of fatalism to the proceedings, a pervasive doubt that Don Cheadle and Benicio del Toro's petty criminals can really pull off their scheme without consequences. This might be their big break, or they may be trapped in a world where things rarely work out for those who don't already hold power. Something hinted at in the mentions of redlining and black neighborhoods being raised even as Detroit boomed under the auto industry. What makes the movie work so well, save from one on-the-nose monologue from a Soderbergh favorite making a cameo, is that the film makes its thematic point without distracting from the plot. In addition, a uniformly killer cast that also includes David Harbour, Ray Liotta, John Hamm, and Brendan Fraser shade in the characters with added depth, and Soderbergh, always one to experiment, shot the whole thing using wide-angled period piece lenses on modern cameras, producing an almost fisheye effect that gives the film a unique look. It's not quite the peak of crime capers or Soderbergh's best work, but it's still one of the highlights of 2021 so far. Grade B+. Other films to watch. For more Soderbergh, Out of Sight. For another fun noir set in the same universe as Out of Sight, Jackie Brown. And for another crime film heavily influenced by its period setting, check out LA Confidential. Have you seen that movie by chance? Have you seen No Sudden Move?
I am. If you could pretty much ask me any movie, and I will not have seen it.
Great. Always good to have solid banter on the film after we do the review.
I'm pretty convinced I want to watch it now. That was a pretty good review.
I like Soderbergh. I have tried to watch some of his movies. They're always interesting. And I have not seen this one, but I look forward to watching it. I did want to mention, for anybody who likes films that tie into that theme. I know that I haven't seen this film, so I don't know if this is a central theme or more of a background place. But there's a good movie out called, I think it's called Mother Brooklyn or something like that. And has Bruce Willis in it along with Edward Norton in it. But that movie also touches on, I think, housing discrimination as well. And for a book on housing discrimination, check out The Color of Law, which is by what's his name? I think. Well, I won't get the author's name. Good banter. No, check out. It's a good book on the subject called The Color of Law, and definitely worth reading about. But the period pieces that do good world building and that that sets the backdrop always make for good films, and always have these important contributions of those effects into the story. So I look forward to watching this film as well, and maybe Joe on his while he's gallivanting about may check it out as well. So very good. Well, Jack, that brings us to chapter 12. Chapter 12, and now we're talking about bad philosophy. And again, kind of highlighting in this book it takes a fairly heavy science bias. In other words, the subjects that the author uses to explain his points often have to do with topics that would be considered science. And so the actual chapter of the title of the chapter is A Physicist's History of Bad Philosophy, with some comments on bad science. And anyways, let's open up this one the same way we did before. Your kind of initial takes on it, your thoughts on it, and your impressions.
Yeah, so he basically starts out sort of comparing how if you look at something like philosophy and the history of philosophy, it's often recommended that you go read these original works to sort of see the inspiration for ideas. And that it's important to do because you can kind of see where the differences are, where these disagreements are, and helps you sort of and that's useful when you're talking about philosophy. If you're you kind of need to do that with philosophy, just kind of the nature of that field. However, with physics, it doesn't really matter. Having learned just so many equations by, people, even ones that were developed fairly recently, like Euler's equations and stuff like that. You don't really learn the history of how they discovered. You just get the equation and it works. And so you don't need to dive into you never dive into the sciences that failed because they failed. But, obviously this has something to do with philosophy. And so the other concept goes back to actually chapter 10 and the epistemology approach where these ideas have to be criticized. I guess more so it would go back to the idea that these ideas have reached. And so he argues that a lot of scientist claims about quantum physics and other claims about, other discoveries throughout time have occurred because of bad philosophy. And then they've just proven to, time and time again, physicists with bad philosophy are proven wrong. And it sort of felt to me like he was like, this was also helping defend his multiverse claim. Was sort of the point of this chapter. Like all three of these lined up. Like first he presents you with the correct philosophy.
Right.
He tells you about the multiverse using the same philosophy that he's been describing the whole book. And then he cements it with this chapter showing all the times physicists have used bad philosophy and been incorrect.
Yes. And in fact, even, rather on the nose, he uses this chapter to defend the multiverse claim, because the first page and a half or so is him saying this is true, and people don't agree with it because of bad philosophy.
Yeah.
Like, that's the author's words, kind of defending his position.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to give the definition. I'm going to read this out of the book. The definition of bad philosophy that he gives. I think it's a really, it's a definition that has a lot of intuitive sense to it. So bad philosophy is philosophy that actively prevents the growth of knowledge. Okay, so actively prevents the growth of new knowledge. And I thought, contrasting that with kind of his defense of good philosophy, or let's say good science, a little bit different, but close enough. This idea that we're not only are we actively trying to improve our knowledge, but that's all we can do. We have to actively make a guess about the world and then criticize that guess to experiment. And the reason I use the word guess, he says, he uses the word conjecture. Synonyms are, close enough, but I'm always reminded there's an interesting quote from Richard Feynman. He gave all these famous Caltech lectures and everything else, but there's a point where he's in an auditorium talking with students, and he says, and then at this point, what scientists do is they make a guess, and the whole room starts laughing. He's like, please don't laugh at that part, because that's really what we do. Like that really, like, we make a guess. Like, that's not funny. Like, that's literally what science entails. And it's very much like business in that sense, where you get to a point where you have information that dictates, kind of this horizon of knowledge, but beyond that horizon truly is the unknown. You really don't know the outcome of something until you do it. And I always think that's an important thing for people to think about when it comes to science, even just if most of us, myself included, are kind of lay people on the outside. But there is a limit to what people ever know at a given point. And the only way to go beyond that limit is to guess at what that above limit might be. And so that's kind of, no matter how smart we are, the next step is always a guess. And I think that is a really important idea for people to take away from this, is that no matter how smart you are, when there's something that you don't know, you have to make, like, you don't just get to know something because you're smart. You have to actually make a guess and conjecture, criticize, etc. Move forward to that next step.
Yeah, that was very well said, and that's sort of what he's claiming about, like, what he said. Schrodinger, even like in one of his own lectures, made a joke that it was the multiverse, and it's like, yeah, that's what your equations are saying. And what good philosophy would tell you is that listen to your equations and then, like, come up with experiments that can test this idea, and Deutsch is claiming that, these experiments have been run, and like there are clearly experiments that illustrate the existence of the multiverse. But there's still, like, it's not a prevailing view, but that's largely, well, in Deutsch's kind of claim is that it's just that, it seems so far-fetched, but so does the idea that the earth revolves around the sun. Like this isn't the first time in science where should the multiverse turn out to actually be real, and it has been somehow provable, then it's like, it's not the first time that, humans have just kind of like, our own specific lives have become substantially less significant,
Right.
like, and he talks a lot about that, especially early in the book, is that how anthropocentric early humans were, thinking that, that we are some divine thing that the universe was created for, which, arguably, if there are no aliens out there, then would be a fair claim, but we're still so insignificant in terms of the size. And like, you find out the size of the actual solar system, and then how many solar systems are in our galaxy, and then how many galaxies are in the universe. And it's just like, and then you find out, like, well, the astronomical, absurd number of universes that could exist should every single possible universe exist. It's absolutely mind-blowing.
Well, and I thought it was funny, just going back to you mentioned the anthropocentric, this idea that the world was made for us. And, one of the ideas that David Deutsch says is like, a lot of the world is completely uninhabitable. I mean, what was made for us? I mean, the ice caps are too cool, other places are too hot. This idea that we live in this idyllic place is like, all right, really? We live in a lot of the world, a lot of the earth is not inhabitable for us. And really what's allowed us to thrive is not living in some kind of Genesis garden, but our ability to think and to improve our situations by using our mind to create wealth. We gave the definition of wealth on last episode, I think, but wealth is the entire repertoire of physical transformations that you can accomplish. And so when the cavemen discovered fire, that increased their wealth, because now all of a sudden their ability to transform a dry bundle of leaves into fire meant that when they got cold, it wasn't, huddle around and hope we make it through the night. It's like, hey, make a fire. It's cold. Let's get burn some of those leaves over there. And
I want to make one quick correction on that.
Yes,
when they discovered the knowledge to create fire, because they certainly had probably experienced fires before.
Yes. Well, good correction. Yeah. Good correction. Yes, when they discovered the knowledge of how to, and let me even make it more specific, to reproducibly make fire, because like, it wasn't just like they would stumble upon it. I'm sure that happened as well, but you're right. When they had the knowledge to create fire by striking a flint on a dry bundle of leaves, now their wealth as a species. I mean, all of us are here to some extent, I would imagine, because cavemen had enough wealth to stay warm through the cold winter months. So I mean, that's a huge boon. And then they discovered metal, and now it's like, wow, if we melt this thing right here, we can shape it into something else, and it cools down again, and it's hard. And it's like, we have a tool now. And all of that is having the knowledge of what physical transformations you can cause to occur. And I wanted to tie that in because, you're right. I always make this point. I think it's a subtle point that David Deutsch makes in the book. What we think of as making us, or what rather the anthropocentric perspective of humans being important, in a way, misses what actually makes human beings special. It isn't that we're living in a world that was made for us. It's that we are these universal constructors, that because of the universality of our mind to conjecture and criticize ideas, to grow knowledge potentially infinitely, as the author claims, we're universal constructors. We can increase our wealth forever as long as we understand the physical transformations that we need to cause to occur in any given situation. And so I do think people are special in that sense. I think we're not special in the sense of, being alive. I mean, I think living is certainly special, but I think human beings is at another level of specialness on top of that, because of our universal thinking capability, rather than the spaceship Earth fallacy that we're living in the Garden of Eden or something. Now, I wanted to also say too, because I liked your talking about his perspective on other theories of quantum mechanics. One obviously bad philosophy of quantum mechanics is the school of shut up and calculate. And why is that bad philosophy? Well, if you just shut up and calculate, you're reducing your mind to a computer, which it isn't. is case in point. I can multiply big numbers in my head. Even if you're good at multiplying big numbers in your head, I can easily write a number down, write two numbers down that you wouldn't be able to multiply in your head. So you're not a calculator. You're a thinking human being. Your mind is different than a calculator.
Mm-hmm.
And what we really are good at is this conjecture and criticism model that, that is science and is good philosophy. If you're in the shut up and calculate school, you're completely closing out any even idea that could come about from thinking about the interpretation of quantum mechanics. And he's really interesting in that, because I would say I always felt this as well. People who make light of interpretation in science, I don't understand. To me, David, the author of the book, David Deutsch, makes the same point. That's the most important part. That's the explanation. That's what gives science reach, is that we actually have an idea about what the equation means. It's that interpretation that is the value, or certainly a substantial part of the value. And to make light of that as like a tag on, like, well, this equation works, and like, maybe it means that, but who really cares? Like, no, we need that. Like, that part is so important. And when you ignore that part and all you do is calculate, that's bad philosophy. Why? Because you're actively prohibiting, by saying it isn't important, don't waste your time doing it, the growth of new knowledge, the growth of interpretation, the growth of understanding. You're saying it's not worth your time, don't do it. And then people don't do it. They just run the simulation, they run their computer program. What's the thing, 17. Cool, moving on to the next one. It's like, well, but wait, why? Why is it 17? Why is it not something else? The interpretation is absolutely important. And so if you're in college and you're listening to this and you're taking a quantum mechanics course, if you're looking for a professor to study quantum mechanics from, I would say have a professor that understands the importance of interpretation, and understands that quantum mechanics shouldn't just be some routine that we do to calculate values. That would be, that's not good science. We need the thinking, the thought, the human mind bringing its full weight to the table. And to do that, we have to explore explanations in our scientific theories. Another great chapter, I thought, in general, though.
Yeah, and I think that really my favorite part is something that you touched on a little bit there. And actually, I don't know if this was, I read some more. I think I went back and read chapter 9 and maybe another chapter as well. And I don't know if I think this was a lot in this chapter, but it's just this idea that knowledge is sort of this weapon against extinction. This might have been the optimism chapter.
Yeah.
And so like we're building this knowledge, and it's like there's so many things that could occur, like the probability. Actually, one I was watching the other day, it was actually like last night, I was watching videos of like the largest volcano explosions and stuff like that.
Right.
And
like right before bed, let me just click on one YouTube video. Oh, Mount St. Helens.
Yeah, but I told you I'm not that bugged by the idea of death anymore, so right. It was totally fine. But like Yellowstone, for example, like it's just like a total hotspot. And they were like showing the diagram of this thing blowing up, like, because basically it erupted like 2.1 million years ago, and then it erupted 1.3 million years ago, and then 650,000 years ago. So more time has transpired
right from its last eruption
than the last two eruptions, than between the most recent eruption and today.
Good.
And or sorry, less time. So there's more
right.
So I mean, like it's still pretty low, but it's like, with the right knowledge, and like especially if we're multiplanetary and like have better seismic equipment, we can mitigate that damage pretty greatly. And then like and then I love the claim. I think this is all in the optimism chapter, but I read that one too, and so I'll talk about it. But it was like, that we'll be on the moon eventually, and like just breathing air, and it'll just be normal. Just how like I'm in Texas right now and it's 95 degrees, but it's just like 72 degrees in my, right. Not that hot right now, but outside. But you get what I'm saying.
Yeah,
it's
right.
Like,
you have
to really live in Texas in the summer,
right.
If you didn't have just AC.
No. If you can make it in Texas, you can make it on Mars. That ought to be what Elon Musk, like that should be why he picked Texas. Like, listen, guys, if you can live here, we can go anywhere. I mean, Pluto, kidding me? This is a cakewalk compared to Texas.
Or Antarctica. People live there year round.
No, right. Yeah, no, that's all true. Yes, knowledge absolutely is part of our ability to perpetuate, human existence and human life. And a part of that knowledge too, which is, I think, it's easy to make light of, but certainly you need the energy sources, the raw materials, the engineering, the science. That's all core. But also, as equally important are the social systems, the politics, the sociology, the psychology. I mean, all of that is equally as important. If you have a team, and of course NASA knows all this, and that's why when they select people, it isn't just, all right, pick the 10 smartest people or pick the 10 strongest people. It's like, no, pick 10 people that can actually live together and be a high functioning team for how many months they're in transit to Mars. Like, if you don't have that part, it doesn't matter how good your technology is. And so that was something that took me a while to understand. And of course, my wife understood that well. She did some development work in college and saw that, the communities that have the right social structures in place have more successful projects than ones who don't, because that is just as core to success as any technology is to any kind of development project or colonizing the moon or Mars, whatever it is. A big part of that task will be figuring out, how do we do politics? How do we do voting? How do we do conflict resolution? All those, quote unquote, boring HR things that turn out to really be super important when you have a team of people and they can't depend on Earth. When you got 100 people on Mars, that's all that they have. They have to be able to work together. There's no, I'm free, I'm leaving, screw it. Where are you going to go, dumbass? You're on Mars. You're going nowhere. Sit your ass down.
I know, yeah.
And notice the brilliance of David Deutsch's book, because notice, if you commit yourself to the conjecture and criticism model, that gives in you a sense of how to handle conflict. Look, we both got to figure out the right thing to do here. So let's have that be our starting point. I know what you think, you know what I think. Let's start from there. Let's realize that the truth lies beyond us, and let's work towards it. That sets up a way to handle conflict. And that it's not easy, it's not trivial, but it's a roadmap. We know what we have to do, so let's figure out how to do it. And actually, the next chapter talks a little bit about politics, the chapter on choices, which we'll get to next time. But I'll say it again. I think this book, a key book to read. I really think that that's true. I've said maybe about 3 books that I think are like really mandatory reading that you just have to have in your library. I say Beginning of Infinity, 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, and Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb. I think those 3 books you have to make time to read, because their ideas are important. I think are necessary for getting us back on track towards, as you were saying earlier, building our knowledge, building our wealth, to keep the show going.
Yeah, I haven't read those other 2. I'm gonna need to. I've heard so much about Nassim Taleb and like keep hearing him referenced, and I know like you got Black Swan idea and all that, and really interesting. I'll have to read those too. But yeah, that was I really enjoyed those 3 chapters, and I've enjoyed this whole book. Honestly, it's just
I have too.
Absolutely, it's changing the way I actually view the world, which is pretty rare for a book to do.
Yeah, and so I've read through the book once, and kind of, when we do these chapter highlights, kind of go back and reread the chapters. But even on my second read through, there's still stuff that I'm catching. And I mean, again, it's a big book. It's not super long, but big book in terms of its ideas, and ideas that are worth trying to incorporate. I mean, that's how I would phrase it. I mean, one of the things that Joe and I talk a lot about on this show is that I really don't want this to feel like a show where we just like talk about things. I don't want it to be a show talking about ideas. So we do a lot of that, but the hope is that it turns into something material in some way, that you figure out a way, me, Joe, anybody who's listening figures out a way to say, all right, I read this book. What am I going to do about it? What am I going to change? If this book was so good, what am I changing to demonstrate that this actually was an important book? And I assume that's a lifelong challenge with a book like this, but I think it's a worthwhile exercise because again, it's a big enough tent that I think anybody can fit under and start working together to fix the problems that appear to be plaguing us as a nation as we speak.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it's a good deal for sure.
Yeah, I agree. Jack, any final thoughts before we close out for today's episode?
Well, just want to say thanks for having me on. It was good to take Joe's spot for the day. What was that?
I was just flashing up the
books
again for our viewers. Yeah, Jack, you were a great guest host. This was a lot of fun. Took it on pretty short notice, actually, and showed up ready to go to bat and consistently knocking out of the park. So Jack, thank you for being on here. Let's give your show one more shout out. Everybody, check out Jack. So go to wherever you're finding podcasts these days. Go to World's Best Podcast with Jack and Reno, and also follow Jack on Twitter at Jack Urness. Urness is spelled Urness. Follow him on there. Check out his show. We'll put all that below our video so you can find it really easily.
Also want to plug our locals page, which is just
go ahead.
locals.com/with Jack and Reno. We've been doing a ton of writing on there.
Great. I like that.
It's free for now.
And then also check out Mutant Fox. I mentioned him at the beginning of the show. He had that tie-in with the chlorine shortage for water treatment up in the northwest. Check him out. He has a nice channel for gaming streaming and tech and all that good stuff. So check him out there as well. And of course, check us out at Roses_Rhetoric. That's our Twitter handle and our Instagram handle, and then also our website, www.rosesandrhetoric.com. And of course, we post all this to YouTube as well. Just search Roses and Rhetoric and you'll find us there. And also follow Joe at Jose4_Squarevo for Twitter and Instagram. But that'll do it for this week. Check us out next time. Until then, ciao.